Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event with Robert Darch. My name is Michael Pritchard, and I'm the Director of Education and Public Affairs at the Royal Photographic Society. The RPS is an educational charity and a membership organisation which seeks to inspire people by showing photography and to help them make their own work. This evening's lecture, which is being recorded, is one of the many hundreds of talks, practical workshops, symposia and conferences which the RPS organises each year. So it's my pleasure this evening to welcome Robert Darch, who I first met at the Martin Parr Foundation a couple of years ago, I think now. And Robert will be talking about his new book, Vale, which has been extremely well received and very well reviewed. Robert is a British artist photographer motivated by geography and the personal responses to place. Vale exemplifies that. He has an MFA and an MA from Plymouth University and a BA from Newport. He's also published and exhibited widely, and Vale is Robert's second book. So the programme for this evening is that Robert will talk through some of his work and the main themes within Vale, and we'll talk for about 40 to 45 minutes, after which I'll open up the public Q&A. We aim to finish around 7 or shortly afterwards. If you have questions, please place them in the chat and we'll get to them for you. And enjoy the evening. So Robert, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thanks to the RPS for inviting me. It's lovely to be able to talk to you this evening. So, as Michael said, I'm going to talk about my new book, Vale, and the project, the genesis of that project. And before, I'm going to give you a little bit of history about myself and how I got to that point of making that work. So, if we go back in time to the year... Oh, let me go look. Let's see if this works. Okay. So in 2000, I went to Newport in Wales to study documentary photography on the BA there. The first year was quite traditional, working in black and white, 35mm. I really enjoyed it. I was around 21 at the time, so I was quite young. I'd worked for a few years beforehand. And I learned a lot really quickly on the course. So started off thinking about images in terms of picture stories and building up narratives. So these images are from like a 5-picture story. And through my parents, I heard of this former captain who was an exorcist and a medium. So I went to meet him for a day and take some pictures. Drawing on kind of some of my interests, which will become apparent in Vale, of sort of the paranormal and eeriness. So quite conventional pictures, black and white, documentary, 35mm. But I suppose with this image, starting to think about images that were a bit more symbolic rather than obvious. But then here we've got something kind of more classic, like a kind of portrait. So I really enjoyed my first year of university and I did quite well. But then something happened just before the start of my second year. I was down in Wales to, as you do, I came down to paint my bedroom before the start of the second year. And I noticed that my vision was going slightly. And then I'd gone to buy some paint and got back to the house and I got out of the car and had a moment of like, I didn't know what I should be doing, and all I needed to do was lock the car. And then as I kind of went into the house and my housemate was talking and they mentioned the word microwave, and I knew the word, but I couldn't link it to the object, so it started panicking me a little bit. So it transpired I had like a minor stroke or a transient ischemic attack. I got taken into hospital and I was in hospital for about 3 days. But the hard part was that there was no explanation of what had happened to me, and I left hospital and I didn't feel right. I didn't really feel well at all. But I ended up going back to my second year of university, and just getting through that year it was quite hard. I mean, I didn't feel well a lot of the time, and a couple of months after that attack, after that stroke, I had a diagnosis of glandular fever. which explained some things in terms of my health and how I was feeling. So the second year was really tough, and especially towards the end of the second year, I couldn't really leave the house much, so I was inside and quite isolated. So I changed how I was working as a photographer, as an image maker, and I started looking internally, and that was at details, interior details, but also doing something unusual for me, like self-portraiture. I mean, here I am with hair. I mean, it's like a rare thing. We're going back in time. And it was really useful for me as an image maker, because I wasn't taking the obvious pictures. I really had to look for images. So that kind of changed my way of seeing. So very much about light and place, and quite relevant now, especially this last year, which has been a horrific year for a lot of people, and we've been locked down and stuck inside. And in some ways, I feel like I had some prior experience and some kind of knowledge of that, and in a way Vale's kind of relevant, because this is a kind of the backstory for Vale. And then sort of 6 to 7 months later, I had a diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME, which is still very misunderstood, but again quite relevant, because we're seeing something called long COVID, which a lot of people are suffering symptoms much longer after their initial illness, which is the same for me. You know, I had the minor stroke, but then I also had the glandular fever. So something was happening. The virus was still active, and it was affecting my health. So I expanded upon this project, this idea, this kind of internal, looking at interior spaces and where I was. And well, it's important to say I had like a year out. So after my second year, I took a year out of university to try and regain my health, which unfortunately didn't happen. So then my final year, so I took 4 years in total to complete my degree, I was at home in the Midlands. So I started making work about other young people that were suffering from ME or chronic fatigue syndrome. And again, you know, similar thing, looking at kind of detail and light and place and about being inside, but also looking, trying to make images that were a bit more abstract, that sort of dealt with this notion of brain fog that I was experiencing, like I couldn't really concentrate, and I had lots of strange and bizarre symptoms. And also my world became much smaller, everything became internalized. You know, I would have weeks where I wouldn't be able to leave the house, or I'd maybe only be able to walk sort of 50 meters or so. So I was quite restricted. So I started living my life vicariously through films and TV. So that became my world. I wasn't seeing too many people, and that was my life, really. It was quite a hard and frustrating period of my life. So after I finished university, I was unwell, and at this point my family, my parents had moved, they'd retired to Devon. So I was trying to cope. I was living alone in the Midlands. I was on benefits, on sickness benefits, occasionally doing bits of volunteer work, but I wasn't able to take many pictures during this period because I didn't have much money, so I couldn't afford film, and I couldn't get out of the house. And at this stage, I didn't want to look inwards anymore. I didn't want to look internally. That really didn't interest me. If anything, I wanted to escape from my situation, you know, so I didn't want to focus on it too much. So this was quite a long period, so like 3 to 4 years. It got to a point where I realized I couldn't cope with it anymore, and it wasn't a place where I felt like I could get better. So I made the difficult decision to move in with my parents, who were living in Devon, and they've very kindly let me live with them. And then over a period of a couple of years, my health gradually began to improve, and that wasn't easy. It was like a long kind of struggle, and took a lot of kind of determination, and there was lots to overcome in terms of mental health issues and kind of expanding my world again, you know, and getting on trains, getting buses, and I moved from volunteer work into paid work, and I started taking pictures again. So this was a kind of move away from film also into digital, and I got a Canon 5D Mark II, and I started taking pictures and I started filming a lot. It was one of the first cameras that came out that were really great for doing moving image and filming. And I was working in an art center doing front of house, and I also was working as a youth worker, and I started working photographically. I was taking pictures of things that interested me. I'd always had an interest in abandoned spaces and places. So this is a picture of an abandoned asylum in Wales. So I was doing that. That was a focus for me. But then I was also taking on kind of more commercial work. So like photographing music festivals and bands at festivals. And also at this point I'd moved into Exeter, which is in Devon, England. And I started to make a big friendship group. And there was a lot happening in terms of I was working on like an art paper. I was doing theatre photography. I had like a little radio show on a public access radio show. And it was interesting at this point, I was kind of near around my early 30s, but it was almost like I'd had like 10 years out of what we see as like a kind of a normal life. So it is strange in a way. I was in my early 30s, but it was almost like in a kind of sense, it was like my early 20s. Like I'd just graduated and just finished. So I was experimenting and trying lots of things. And I quite often found that I had a friendship group that was around my age, but then I was also doing things with people that were almost 10 years younger, and they were making things happen. So I was busy doing this work. And then there were a couple of things that made this shift really from doing kind of commercial work. And I was doing documentaries for arts organizations like the Arnolfini in Bristol and SpaceX when it existed in Exeter, and creating like sort of short films and documentaries for them. And there were two things that made this shift from doing work for other people into me kind of thinking about making work as an artist. And one of them was I met my current partner, Jessica. She'd come to study photography at Plymouth University to do a master's, and I met her through a mutual friend. And that was really great because it was kind of like a way back into that world. And also, interestingly, the masters are being taught by Jem Southern, who, while I was studying for my BA, was always one of my favorite photographers. I had a lot of interest in the American photography and American landscape and kind of portrait photography, but Jem was one of the few sort of English photographers that whose work really appealed to me. This is a portrait of me taken by my partner Jessica from a project that she worked on called Two Cities. So it was this kind of combination of these two events really that kind of led to me going back to university to do a master's. I was actually quite reticent. I didn't really want to do it. I didn't see how it was quite relevant for me. And I think also I was a bit nervous because I'd gotten ill whilst I was studying for my degree, and I was conscious that maybe part of the reason for that was something to do with me as well, and my ambition at that point, and my kind of perfectionism and my kind of drive for success. So I was kind of wary. There was, I think for me, like a huge psychological block about going back and thinking, okay, this is what I want to do. I kind of want to be an artist, I want to make work, and then I want to try and put it out into the world. So this is a book, The Red River by Jem Southern. And I bought this while I was studying for my degree at Newport, and it's, I think, still probably my favorite book. I mean, if you can get hold of a copy, try and seek it out, or if you're studying, hopefully it's in your university library. I mean, it's just a brilliant book in terms of like an exploration of place, very sort of quiet, poetic images, which really appealed to me. And I know whilst I was studying for my BA, I suppose I aspired to making work like this, but at that stage, I didn't really feel like I had the emotional or the kind of the emotional intelligence to make that work. This is another of Jem's images from his first, I'm saying first, I'm just drawing that, I think he did some things before, but from his book, The Raft of Carrots. And it always intrigued me, like a raft of carrots, why is there a raft of carrots? So is that kind of ambiguity that really appealed? And this is an image from the Red River. So it's very atmospheric. in terms of dealing with place, and Jem talks a lot about like mythologies and how like within pictures you can sort of retell and show this idea of this kind of this mythology to do with place and landscape. And for me, this kind of draws on like books I read as a child, like maybe like the Famous Five or something like that. Some kind of something's happening in this kind of old ruin, as smugglers or something. So you always, as a person, you bring all your own sort of, I don't know, your life experience to how you view something. That's how you do it. So I made the decision to study the masters, and it was really interesting. It was like just a switch clicked, and I was like, this is what I'm doing, and I started making work. So the summer before I started the masters, so this would have been 2013. I just started getting up really early and going down into the valley just to the north of Exeter to take pictures and make work. I'd bought a new camera, so I was still shooting on a digital camera, but this time it was a Nikon. And it was kind of a game changer for me, really, because it allowed me to photograph in this 5:4 format. So very much how I used to work in medium format with the Mamiya 7. And almost everyone thinks I shoot on medium format and film, which I always take as a compliment, but I shoot digitally. My work's all digital. And there was part of me that was just trying to get back into the swing of making pictures in a kind of more considered way and getting used to the camera. But there was this very specific interest in place. And because of my experience, I think like you have a life experience like that and it really changes you. So there was really this celebration of nature, and you know, I'd found myself in Devon. It was almost like fate in a way that I ended up in Devon, and then I met my partner Jessica, and then I ended up living around the corner from Jem Southern, and then I ended up doing the masters. It's, you know, it kind of felt like fate brought me here. So these images really were sort of a celebration of nature, this sort of bucolic English landscape. And I hadn't really planned to do much else with those pictures. But now I'll talk a little bit about how Vale came together, and quite often how I work in terms of an artist. So normally there's this initial interest in place. So I start to form an opinion or an idea around place and how I react to it. And I think one thing I always look for is the sense of the storybook landscapes. So in terms of the English landscape, for me, it's very much informed by literature and painting, whereas the American landscape for me is informed by movies and TV and American photography. So for me, I look for these landscapes that feel like they're from a storybook. And a couple, or maybe a year before I went back to do the masters, I'd been working in the youth service for 3 years, and I left that job just before all the youth funding got cut, sadly. And I always wanted to do something. I wanted to set up like a group or like a collective for younger photographers, in a kind of cheesy way. I kind of wanted to share my passion or interest or knowledge of photography. And at this point, I kind of felt like I wasn't pursuing any kind of, I didn't have any aspirations to kind of make work or push my work out into the world. So I thought it'd be nice to kind of share my sort of interest with like a bunch of keen youngsters. So I set up a little group which kind of morphed into this collective, Macula Collective. And it was a really kind of loose kind of group. It wasn't formal like college or university. So in a way, it was kind of sort of more of a social group for people to get together, talk about photography, take pictures. We would meet up on every Tuesday, and we would go out. Obviously, we're very lucky to live where we do in Exeter and in Devon. We've got so many great places close to us. You know, we're not far from the moor, from Dartmoor, or from the coast. We've got the river estuaries. We've got sort of fields and woodlands. So we've got so much to explore. So I just naturally started taking pictures of the members of the people in the group, and that kind of continued. And for me, like, I've always been quite an obsessive photographer, like an obsessive image taker. So whatever I'm doing or whatever I'm part of, I'm always taking pictures. So we jumped back in time now. So this is the kind of mid to late 1990s, when I was sort of like a teenager, and I started taking pictures. I was skateboarding at the time, so I was just taking pictures of my friends skateboarding, and also those quiet moments in between. My friends called me paparazzi because I was just always taking pictures. I had this, I don't know, this, it's like an obsessional thing, you know, it's what I love to do. So I'm always making work. So that hopefully gives like a little bit of context to that sort of way of working. So especially with Macula, from, I suppose, like May through to September, we'd go out on the Tuesdays, we'd have these lovely kind of spring and summer evenings. And for me, the group was very much about exploring and seeing, maybe less so about taking pictures, about sharing my interest in going to places and looking and experiencing the places, or trying to think about how those places make you feel, and the difference between different kinds of light or weather or location. And that was what it was about, really. It was about this sort of quite sort of romanticized sort of exploration of place. And there's lots of work that I took, you know, not all of it made its way into Vale. So at some point I will probably do something with these images as well. And some of these were made before Vale and some of these were made after Vale. So that, for me, there's always these different elements that start to come together that create a project. So in a way, like when I'm looking at the collective and my reasoning behind that, I also have to admit that there was a sense of, you know, I was coming into like my mid-30s. There was this element of trying to recapture something in my youth. Like I lost a huge period. You know, I had like a great kind of sort of slightly debauched, like 16 to kind of 20, you know, like skateboarding and partying. But there was that huge gap in between, sort of like 20 to 30, which I'd lost. So I was almost like living a little bit vicariously through the members of the group, not in a kind of cringy way that I was like trying to be part of their lives, but it was just more about the kind of their energy and their interest in, you know, different things. It was all kind of quite new, whereas for me that wasn't the case. So that was one element of Vale that I'd started doing. And then kind of just after I'd started my master's, a friend of mine that I knew quite well, that I worked with in like a part-time job I was doing, he was a filmmaker, and he had some funding to do a short horror film in mid-Devon, and he asked me if I wanted to come along and take some stills. And obviously was like, yes, I was really interested, because that ticks a lot of my kind of interests in terms of, you know, the location being in mid-Devon, like quite rural, like they'd rented this semi-abandoned farmhouse that was due to be auctioned at an auction, and the couple had moved out, but their cousin, this old guy, was still just living in one of the rooms, but he wasn't there during the filming. So it was like a really interesting place, like location. So obviously spent a lot of time taking pictures sort of behind the scenes, like, you know, action stuff happening, like film documenting that, like looking at the shots. But then also, you know, because we were there for a long time, I became interested in some of these other spaces. So this was the bedroom that the old cousin was living in, and for me it completely appealed to me. It felt like something from a horror film or something from a dream. It didn't feel really real. And also this sense of like latterly in terms of Vale, there's this idea of the outside and the inside, and the inside's quite claustrophobic, and it's in a way it's a kind of like a memory of those years that I was stuck inside. So you've got that contrast between the outside and the inside. And the room, like the bed was all kind of lumpy, and there was dust everywhere and like mold on the walls, and you've got this kind of religious iconography on the wall. So that kind of really appealed. So I only took like a few pictures that made it into the book or the project that would come Vale. This was another one. I like the idea of the doll's house, this notion of like a house within a house, and it's that kind of childhood and nostalgia, but there's also something quite creepy and unsettling about like a doll's house. And then this is the final image in Vale. So this was the living room that was in the house. So the set dressed it a little bit with some of the religious iconography, like the cross, and then on the mantelpiece, like the Jesus on the cross, and some of the pictures, and some kind of mist in the room, some smoke, so you get this kind of refracted light going on. So that's like a good explanation of how this picture happened, because it kind of, quite a few people look at it and think, what is that, you know? But there's obviously, which I'll in a minute talk about, there's kind of elements of that I really relate to. There's that kind of shared experience of aesthetic, really, in terms of what's going on in this picture. So I started bringing these elements together. I started thinking more about the pictures I was taking with the members of the collective, and I started thinking about this idea of an atmosphere I was trying to create with this work, and then really started thinking about, well, what is the work about? And for me, it was this sense of this lost time, this period I'd lost in my life. And I was kind of recreating this imagined summer that didn't exist, this kind of past, this really like completely romanticized summer with kind of young, photogenic, beautiful people in a beautiful landscape. But important that there was something eerie or something unsettling about the work, that something didn't feel quite right. And for me, that's the bit that I bring into it in terms of my experience. So Dan Cox, that wrote the text for the book, he did a wonderful text of the book. He talked about this idea of the people being stand-ins for me, which is very much how I saw it. And for a lot of my work, the people, they're their own people, but they also act as stand-ins for me or my emotions or my kind of, or the sense, the feeling I'm trying to express. And also there was kind of obvious links. So Will here in this picture, he's got like a Nikon FM2, which was one of my first cameras. I mean, the plaid shirts, and he was skateboarding at the time. So I could see these like similarities between myself and the young people and their experiences. So it really became about building up like a sense of place. So I'm photographing in like the valley north of Exeter, in different places in this valley, but I'm starting to build up, and this always happens in my head, this idea of like, okay, this will work, like this image, for example, that I found this online when I was just looking on like Google Maps. Somebody put a picture and said, this bridge is great, that will really fit into this idea of this fictionalized valley, this kind of place that I'm trying to create. So as well as a sense of place, is this always like an atmosphere, and they tend to go hand in hand. Equally, this landscape, which is very quiet, but perhaps one of my favorite images from the series, because it really talks about place for me. This idea of just fields, that light, that early morning light, you can see that quite warm, strong light, and you know, summer. So you have all those different elements coming together. And as well as that, me as a person, you know, you bring your own personal experience, and I think what's always been key to this work is what I'd call formative influences, as well as formative experiences. But formative influences, so books I read as a child, so like really horrible graphic horror novels like by James Herbert, like Rats. I'm scared of rats, so it's probably from the rats. And then, you know, books like Watership Down, things like the Enfield Haunting, like I was obsessed with poltergeists and ghosts when I was really young. And TV, the BBC, the children's TV at the time in the 70s, they had a thing called the Children's Film Foundation, and those films were repeated in the 1980s, and I watched a lot of them, and they were often to do with like young people and exploring and adventure, so very similar themes. And then as I got a bit older, films, so like David Lynch, a lot of people have said the work's very Lynchian, so like Blue Velvet and Wim Wenders with Paris, Texas. Lots of horror films. I watch lots of horror films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, in terms of like the summer and the light, that kind of that feel, that aesthetic. American Beauty, again dealing with light, atmosphere, like surreality. And also Paper House, which was a film I watched when I was quite young, and I watched again recently. And it's about a young girl that has glandular fever. She's stuck inside and she's creating these imaginary worlds in her head, and it becomes like this very kind of surreal, dreamlike film. But it was only when I watched it recently that I clocked that, you know, she had glandular fever. All I remembered was this very sort of surreal work. And I think maybe people that know my work might see some similarities between the image on the left and my other series, The More. So these things just seep in. And also now, interestingly, this film was filmed in Devon, you know, which I, again, wouldn't have known at the time. And then other elements are like Southern Gothic, as always, the American Southern Gothic's been an interest. I used to really love the band REM when I was younger. It's just some stills from one of their music video, like abandoned house, young lad, skateboarding, nice light. So all these different things are always kind of coming back in. And then when I started studying photography at Newport, so I got introduced to photographers. So you have like William Eggleston, whose work sort of really appealed to me, and William Christenbury, which is the bottom left, and bottom right's William Christenbury, but top right is a still from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So you've got very similar kind of semiotic imagery going on in these different, you know, horror films, B-movie horror films, but then quite well respected photographers and artists. And so I pull that influence into the work, into Vale, which you can see here in these two pictures, I think. And then one of my favorite films when I was growing up was the film Stand By Me. That was quite important. So there was a huge part of when I was inside and I was unwell. And I think like a lot of people have been doing now, that kind of, there's a sense of nostalgia and watching things that are comforting and familiar. And that was always like a go-to familiar film for me. So, you know, I have these elements. So I had like the portraits I was taking with my collective members. I had some pictures I took on my friend's film. And then I thought about Stand By Me, and then I organized a day for 3 close friends that I knew to walk down the river, and they spent a day just walking and swimming down the river, and I took pictures as they did that. So again, it was sort of similar themes about journeying, place, and it's interesting in a way, because I was making a work, this work about this fictionalized sort of lost imagined summer, but the person photographed here, my friend Ollie, like looking back on it now, because I made this work in sort of 2014, 15. I mean, he said, he wrote to me, he said, now it feels like an impossibly idyllic moment from a lost time, like something out of a dream. So it's really interesting for him. Some of the other people, it's this, again, this sense. And I suppose, especially now, like the time we're living in now with COVID and Brexit, it's, you know, looking back, you know, it's quite a familiar thing to look back. So then I started photographing other friends and slowly building up the work, like the people, the portraiture, and using devices. Like in this picture, I quite often have people looking off camera, off screen in a way, as if they're seeing something. So I'm creating this like smaller narrative with this gaze, this kind of melodrama, and trying to create some tension that way in the pictures. And then perhaps an image that's slightly different to some of the other images was this picture of my friend Izzy. And really it's, I suppose it's about growing up and motherhood and that place that I was in, you know, like okay, I was kind of mid-30s, but I felt like I had that lost point, and I was kind of, this is it. This is like moving into adulthood, and that's that distinction in terms of that age between being young, you know, like a lot of the collective members, when I photographed them, they're kind of like 17, that kind of, that age, you know, really when you're kind of moving from a teenager into being an adult. So I thought it felt like it was an important image in the series, because it's kind of a, you know, it's like a sort of stop in a way. And then these are some stills from the film Stand By Me. So I suppose I didn't consciously do this, but there was this sense of throughout, you know, throughout Vale, through the work, you start off with these very warm, kind of like summer bucolic landscapes, and then towards the end, the images get a bit colder and darker. And the film Stand By Me, it's from a short novella by Stephen King. It's about a group of young friends in the 1950s America. They hear about a boy that's been hit by a train and killed, and so they go to look for him to find his body. So it starts off kind of fun about this kind of adventuring and exploration and about being young, but then when they get to close to finding the body, it kind of changes. And in a way, you know, the film and the book is about that kind of change from being a kid into adulthood. So you can kind of see here we have like a quite a warm image, and then you're moving into like a colder, this kind of picture of a dead hare surrounded by all this broken glass. Or here you have like a really warm meadow, and then you have the image which I showed earlier of the interior of the house and the doll's house. And here you have like the first image, which is a landscape, and then the final image. So you open this very kind of wide landscape, dawn light, into this very claustrophobic, kind of creepy, haunted living room. And then it's interesting, throughout the work, like I started finding these images. I call it like serendipity, really, that these things happen. So I just happened to borrow like a longer lens from university, and I was out one evening, and it was kind of like golden hour, and all these insects were like flying above the river, and they were just like creating this amazing kind of image, really, and they were getting picked up by the light, and it was just beautiful. So I happened to get this picture. And then another evening I was out walking, and I discovered this bee swarm in a sawn up log, you know, and I mean completely surreal. And I found it interesting how this stuff just happened, you know. I've never come across anything like this since, you know, and it was just, for me, sort of right time and right place. Similarly with the hair picture, just felt really kind of serendipitous, or you know, that I started to find these images, and really, I suppose, underlying this sense of eeriness within the work, this English sense of the eerie, again, that's come from literature, the ghost stories of M.R. James particularly, and kind of working in a tradition of like eerie in the English landscape. And I suppose in terms of the work, perhaps the most fortuitous moment was I'd gone out, I'd found this abandoned house on the edge of this village in Devon called Black Dog, and I'd gone out with one of the collective members, Pete, and his girlfriend at the time, Jazz, just to take some pictures, and we spent an evening there taking pictures one summer. But then when I was reviewing the pictures, something caught my eye, and it looked like a figure in the window of this abandoned house. And as I sat on my computer and I zoomed in, like just a chill went down my spine, and I was just like, oh my God, that looks like a figure in the window. And as I zoomed in, it looked like a figure, and it looked like it had a face. And, you know, the rational me is like, well, it's just a trick of the light, it's just how it's falling, you know. But the kind of unrational is like, well, something else. It's a kind of ghost of the past. It felt quite profound and quite relevant in terms of the project and the work. And so I made this work whilst I was doing the masters, and this was from 2013 to 2015. And I published my first book, The More, in 2018 with Another Place Press. And I decided for this book I wanted to self-publish. I wanted to experiment with self-publishing and see how that would work. I mean, for various reasons. I think one of the reasons was that I felt like the work was very personal and I could have some control over the layout and the flow and the narrative of that work. But also, I suppose, in terms of an artist, at this point or a bit before, I was, for 10 years, I've worked like 2 part-time jobs in, like, I suppose, service industry, like 0 hours, working in an art center and a cinema, while also doing some part-time lecturing, and slowly kind of moving away from those service jobs into kind of lecturing more. But also felt like I wanted to, make some, it sounds horrible in a way, but make some money, that my work, that my practice earns me some money. So by self-publishing, that was the idea, that I would get some kind of money to allow me to keep making work. And I felt like self-publishing was a good model for that. So I tried to do it as kind of economically as possible, but it still involves some collaboration. So I spent a lot of time. I was really interested in having like an illustration on the front cover to reference this idea of like the storybook or like a children's book. Those kind of connotations really interested me. So I found Anna Skeels, who is from Dorset originally, like an illustrator and artist, and I loved her work. So I commissioned her to do the front cover. And then I was quite lucky that I knew some people, and a friend of mine, Nia Gould, is like a really talented illustrator and designer. So she just helped me out with the typography and a bit of the design, but the layout I did all myself. And then I commissioned Dan Cox, who's a curator at the V&A, and I'd met him a few years previously. And I just felt like he'd be the right person to write this for me, like a similar kind of age. He had and these weird things. Sometimes he had a background in BMXing and I did skateboarding, and you sometimes just feel like somebody will have the same kind of reference points. So we spoke a lot about the work, and he wrote a lovely text for me, which I included in the book. And I think maybe in the questions I could talk a bit more about self-publishing if people are interested. Thank you very much for coming to the talk. The book is available to buy. I mean, it's great. It's doing really well. I've nearly sold 3/4 of the copies. Feel free to use, there's a RPS code for 10% off. If you've already bought the book, then just ping me a message and I'll make sure you'll have some extra discount off like a future publication I do. My aim is to keep self-publishing my work moving forward. And yeah, I think that's me. I think that's my talk. There's my website and my Instagram. Thank you very much for coming along and giving up your evening to listen to me.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Robert. We'll leave that image on the screen, actually. People don't need to see my face. So we've had some really great questions come in. So I think I'm going to jump straight into the audience questions, because some of them duplicate some of the ones I'd noted. And in fairness, your talk's been so comprehensive that you've picked up on a lot of the questions I'd noted down. Although I probably will jump in with a couple of them a bit later. So I'm going to just go back to some of the first questions that we had in. So I'm just scrolling backwards here. They're coming in thick and fast from different directions. So Jamie Howes is asking about the process of sequencing and publishing your books. And again, I've noted that as well, that clearly you said in your talk that you had a lot more images than you could use. So could you just talk a little bit about that process of sequencing and how you selected the images?
Yeah, it's not easy. And actually the project before I self-published was maybe like 10 images more in it. But even before that, there were a lot more images. So for example, of pictures of people, particularly, obviously you'd have pictures like the bee swarm, you know would go in, but I'd have several different images from people, and it's like, which one shall I pick? And it's really hard sometimes. It's just a gut feeling that that's the right one. for me, like a lot of this stuff, it's like a process that happens in my head, and I think, okay, this will work in terms of a flow. I'll print all the images out as little work prints. I'll put them on the wall and I'll play around with them. And I think, you know, in terms of doing the book, I really just wanted to, like, not boil, that's a horrible word, but I just really wanted to really get the essence of the project, you know. So if I felt like images were repeating too much, then they didn't go in. So I suppose that's how I worked in terms of layout, and the layout of the book. I kept it quite simple. You know, I didn't want to kind of reinvent the wheel. I think it was like the first book I'd self-published, so I was kind of conscious of that in terms of playing with the layout. So it's really something like a process that happened over a couple of years, just really working down through those images to the ones that I felt worked best for the order. Obviously, like, you had a starting and an end, and then everything in between, you kind of work out what's best.
And did you produce several dummies, or did you was it just a very iterative process, or did you produce a mock-up initially and then go back and revisit it over a period of time?
Yeah, and I produced a mock-up for my masters, like a book, like a hand sewed a book, and did like a hardcover book. And then I went back over it. So I did several dummies. I could print things out and played around and looked at order and flow. Did several different PDFs. So it's just like a slow process of just trying to work out what's right. And I think, you know, for me, this works very personal. The narrative that's very important. So for some people, they struggle in terms of thinking of sequencing and ordering. I mean, luckily, I feel like I know what to do because it's my work and it's what I've created, and we talk a lot about this idea of narrative. There's like a definite narrative flow always to my work, but you know, it's everybody that views it will bring their own, you know, their own life experience, or they will read it in a different way, and that's fine. You know, I'm happy if they just look at it as a hopefully maybe a set of like kind of quite sort of pretty images, but you know, there's all these different layers.
Okay, thank you for that. So Max Smith is, firstly, he's complimenting you about the book, which he absolutely loves. And then his question is that you mentioned the sense of isolation that you experienced during your illness and how that changed you and how you worked. Have you found that the recent lockdowns have taken you back to that way of thinking and working? And how has lockdown affected your present work?
Yeah, so the illness, that life experience changed me completely as a person. You know, I was like a very different person before, and you know, if you have something like that, then it will, you know, it'll change you. You know, it's kind of, I'm less kind of ambitious and driven and kind of more happy and content with less, you know, because you've experienced like such a low point that you know, anything else is compared against that. And the current lockdown, really, for me, you know, I don't really want to cheapen it, but hasn't felt too hard because I had that previous experience, you know, where felt like I had no control over my health or my body, or I couldn't get out, whereas I can still get out now for exercise, for running, you know, and I don't feel so trapped. In terms of work, I've been quite lucky that I've been working on a long-term commission from Beeford Arts, documenting ash dieback in the landscape. So I haven't been really making too much personal work. I made one project, which I haven't published yet on my website, which was photographing like a young actress through Zoom. So like a series of Zoom portraits, and then reusing old pictures of mine that I took. So that's one project I made. So I kind of embraced something new, but really I've been working on this commission. So I've been quite fortunate in that sense. I've been able to carry on making work.
So just, you say you've been working for Beeford Arts. Have you, is Revilius one of your influences? Has that influenced you? Because he did so much of, well, his work obviously was Devon-based as well, and I can see resonances of some of his work and approaches in your own work.
Yeah, I mean, obviously like an unbelievable body of work that he created over like a period of like 15, 20 years, like living in a community, taking pictures, thousands and thousands of pictures. You know, if anyone doesn't know about it, look up the Beeford Archive. The Revilius work is unbelievable. So yeah, I think there's definitely an influence in terms of dealing with place, and in some of my other projects like my series Dulscombe, you know, I'm obviously aware of Revilius's work, and I'm making documentary work in that series, but it's skewed, so it's not like a kind of classic documentary, so it's kind of more about my family history and again, you know, my kind of lived experience.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a very practical question here from Anthony, who's asking, who did you self-publish with? And he's questioning whether it was Kindle Direct. Are they good with photographic books, or who else would you recommend?
So for me, self-publishing was finding a printer. So it wasn't using anything like Blurb or Kindle, anything like that. So it's a bit more involved. So it requires like a reasonable amount of knowledge and skill. So working with like InDesign in terms of like laying your book out. And it's like lithographically printed. So using plates, so like traditionally printed. So getting like a scatter proof to check the colors. So it's quite an involved process, and if you don't know too much about it, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that way. But you can print with any printer, like digitally, if they do Indigo Press, like the digital print's quite good these days. So it's just about finding a printer that's used to doing books. I printed with printers in Wales called Goma, and their kind of stock in trade is printing books. But there's like another printer called Team in Leeds, or a lot of people print abroad in Europe, like Italy quite famously, but you know, Barcelona and Netherlands are quite popular places to print books. So it's not something I'd advise for a beginner, but you know, it can be done.
Again, another practical question here from Paul, who's asking, do you post-process your work much, or is it mainly the golden hour, the time of day, that creates that distinctive look and atmosphere?
Yeah, so it's a lot to do with light. So I like to try and get the picture right on location. I mean, I bring that kind of history of learning stock and trade, like using film and shooting on negative and slide. So for me, it's about not so much about post-processing, but I do post-processing. So I work in Photoshop. I'll play around with exposure, like the black point, a bit of selective stuff now, like the warmth, you know, make sure the warmth feels right to how I took the picture, the temperature. But my main thing is that when people look at my work, I don't want them to see any element of process. So for them, it looks like they're looking at maybe something that feels like a film picture. So I don't want them to look at it and think, oh, I've seen what he's done here, or what he's done there, you know, or he's brought the sky in too much. So for me, it's important that the images feel quite natural.
And we've got a great question here from Abigail. She wanted to say hello, but she also wanted to say that her mum had ME in her 20s from glandular fever, and also talks about a retreat into comforting childhood stories. And she's asking whether you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between the youthful subjects and the viewer photographer. She feels that the viewer seems to bring disruption to the imaginary world.
So as in the person looking at the pictures,
Yeah.
going to disruption. I don't know. I maybe wouldn't. I mean, it's obviously all staged and constructed, but I wouldn't. I'd almost see it as like a visual storybook. So you know you're looking at fiction in the same way. I don't know. It's tricky, isn't it? Yeah. I don't know. I think what interests me is like a middle ground always in my work. So if people are looking at it, they're not sure whether it's been staged or whether it's documentary, that there's an element of ambiguity there. That's something that's you can't really, you know, understand that. But I mean, in terms of a question like breaking that, I mean, there's no way around that, really. I mean, it's kind of, it's.
I think that's quite a deep question there. So
Yeah.
no pressure to answer that.
No.
Josh is asking, do you think your tough times when you were younger made you stronger and more resilient?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. Yeah, I mean, if you've been through something like that, that's apparent, you know, and I think that, you know, you, in terms of working for everything that you get to, I mean, in terms of like making work and putting it out there and like having like a little bit of success, there's a huge element of luck that comes into that, and I talked a little bit about this sense of fate and like not choosing to move to Devon and then being in Devon and then meeting my partner and then living around the corner from Gem and then doing the masters. So you have all these different elements that come together that sort of dictate your life, really, and some of these choices, you know, are out of your hands. It's just fate or what happens. But definitely it's made me tougher, but it's also made me less, I suppose, less stressed. You know, like I see a lot of young photographers that are like overwhelmingly ambitious, and if they don't get a certain thing or they don't get that, then, you know, it's kind of, it's devastating for them. All they, I suppose, they kind of match their expectations against other people and contemporaries, and it's always going to end up being quite a negative process if you do that. You know, it's kind of, I don't know.
Yeah, I think you made that point really well during the presentation. So we have a question from Sam, who's asking, do you have a preference in seasons in which to shoot? And he follows that by saying, I know Vail works very closely with warm light. So was curious to know if you preferred the warmer seasons.
Weirdly, I mean, Vale shot in the summer. I normally don't like shooting in the summer. It's like, it's one of the hardest times to get the light right. You have, because the sun is so harsh in the summer. So it's a very small window of like very early mornings, like 3:34 in the morning being out, and then the last bit, the kind of evening, where you get that moment where you have that softness. I think for me, I really love shooting in the winter and autumn, because you get this great kind of flat light, or you get some kind of color picked up in the clouds. So I mean, there's not a huge preference, but, you know, I'd swing towards kind of autumn and winter over summer.
So we just got a few more questions, which we'll take, because we did start a few minutes after 6. So again, a very practical question from Ashley, who's asking whether you can say something about how well you've enjoyed doing all the admin around marketing your book, and does this help or hinder your creative process?
I just separate it off as something else. I think, like, if you're going to self-publish, I think as soon as you make that decision that you're making work that you're pushing out into the world, and you self-publish, you're not with a publisher, so you have to do everything, you know, the printing, and then the marketing's part of that as well. So, you know, me as a person, my natural instinct is to be someone that stands in the corner of the room, you know, but if you're marketing a book, you've got to keep doing that, and it's like a real subtle balance sometimes between not pushing it too much, but trying to put it out there and get features and get people to write about it, because that's how you make sales, and that's how you sell books, and then that gives me money so I can make more work and carry that on in a way. And it's I appreciate it's a tricky balance, but, you know, for me, I think it's important that the book sells and makes money, rather than, you know, I don't necessarily agree with the traditional model. Like, you know, quite a lot of publishers will charge photographers and artists £15,000 to £30,000. They will print their book. The publisher's already been paid. They don't necessarily need to worry about selling copies. I just think as a model, it doesn't necessarily work. You know, if you told people outside of the bubble, well, that's how it works, I probably think it was a bit crazy.
So Hannah is, well, firstly, she's congratulating you, saying your work's amazing, but she also says she'll be definitely purchasing the book, and she's asking what inspired you to name the book Vale.
Okay. Yeah, so Vale, I mean, I like these titles. So, like, my first book was The Moor, and then so it describes a place. And Vale's the same, so it's like a kind of more Old English word for valley. But for me, like Vale has this kind of, sort of King Arthur kind of like mythological connotations to it. But I also like the sense that you have Vale, Vale, but Vail as in Veil. It's the same pronunciation, but there's a lot that's veiled in the work, like Veiled, like kind of hidden. So that was the reason.
Yeah, and so John is saying, well, firstly, he's thanking you very much for the work. And do you have or imagine a definitive narrative or story to the book, or do the images form a flow in your own mind?
I think the images just form a flow. So if you take this book Vale, it's like a bit more ambiguous. It's a kind of, each of my projects will if you have like a midpoint towards documentary and staged. So if you know my work, so like Vale is a kind of mixture really of sort of documentary, out and about, seeing images, just getting them as they were, but then also thinking about people and staging some things. Whereas my project The Moor was much more towards the stage side. And then my series of Mid Devon Durlscombe is much more documentary. It's just taking pictures of things happening. So
and then just finally, and you touched on this during the presentation, but Chris is saying that he thought it's really interesting that you chose to have an illustration which was from Anna Skills on the cover of the book. Was there any particular reason other than the fact it sort of related back to childhood stories?
I think like that sense of the Penguin storybooks, that notion of like it's building on this idea of it being like a kind of storybook, like something that's fictionalized. And I think that it's not obvious, and I think I understand like photography books will have a picture on the front of it because it's a photography book, but I like the idea of doing something slightly different and almost like increasing the surreality of the image. It's it's more like if that was a photographer, it'd be like something like Crutzen, like this bright kind of light beaming out something. I quite like the idea that was an illustration rather than a photograph. I mean, interestingly, this is a photograph I've taken. Like the layout is a photograph that I ended up not including in the series. So Anna used that as a reference point. So the house is exactly like that, and the telegraph pole and the tree line. It's just the moon and the lights. Not.
Okay. I think that's probably a really good point to stop. So on behalf of the Royal Photographic Society, I'd like to thank you, Robert, for joining us and for sharing your thoughts and your career with us. For anyone that hasn't bought the book, and I'm going to hold a copy up here, I would encourage you to buy it. It's a wonderful publication. It's beautiful, it's thoughtful, and Dan's essay introduction is really helpful in helping to contextualize the photographs, but ultimately it's the photographs that are just absolutely wonderful, and there's so much depth to them. So do buy it. It's an edition of 750, I think.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned that it's selling quite well. So
yeah, good. I've done nearly 3/4 in 3 months, which I think.
So again, thank you, Robert, for that. Do go and buy the book. You've got the links on the website, and thank you for joining us all this evening. Thank you very much indeed. Good night, everyone.